Welcome back to Fantasy Football Today, presented by Capital One. We're doing a schedule breakdown following the NFL schedule release on Thursday night. I'm Jamey Eisdenberg. That's Richard. That's Heath Cummings. Let's get into some notable matchups for the 2022 campaign. We'll start in week one with what should be a fun game between the Bills and the Rams. We're going to take a look at some of the season-long storylines that we could be looking at for these teams. So, Dave, I'll start with you with Buffalo. We know they got a new running back in James Cook. Devin Singletary was amazing to close the season last year and did well in the playoffs. But now with the pass catching back there, the youngster from Georgia, Dalvin Cook's younger brother, can Devin Singletary still be a startable fantasy option in 2022?
I think he's startable. I just think you've got to think about his upside being very limited by James Cook being there. The Bills made it very clear they wanted to have a pass-catching running back added to their group of weapons on offense, which means this is still going to be an offense that, yes, of course, is going to revolve around Josh Allen. There will be times where Devin Singletary will need to help grind down the clock. There will be times where he needs to score from short yardage. So he's going to be able to help fantasy managers, but I don't know if we can look at him as somebody that's going to consistently give you 15 PPR points per week like he was doing last year because James Cook is there this year. So draft him as a number 3 running back. You'll feel okay.
And you see the consensus rankings. That's because Heath is very much against Devin Singletary this year. You can listen to more about that on our Fantasy Football Today podcast. You can find it where podcasts are available. Heath, when we look at the Rams, some changes happening for them. Receiving corps certainly in flux. No more Robert Woods. No more Odell Beckham as of now. They bring in Allen Robinson, who once upon a time was one of the best fantasy wide receivers, but was terrible in 2021 due to injury and poor play. Can he bounce back, go through that Rams car wash with Matthew Stafford, and be a startable fantasy wide receiver once again?
Yeah, I think what we saw from Odell Beckham last year in this team, it gives you a little bit of hope, although Beckham didn't really do much in terms of yards. He just scored a bunch of touchdowns. It gives you hope because he's going to a very good offense that is going to score a lot of touchdowns, and maybe he'll produce that way. Maybe he'll find some other way. But I don't think he's someone that you should view as a reliable, definitely not a borderline number one like he used to be, and I wouldn't call him a reliable number 2. Simply because we don't have a long history of wide receivers changing teams at his age, talking about an age 29 wide receiver by the time the season starts, coming off a miserable season like he was, and then turning back into must-start fantasy options. I would view him as a number 3 wide receiver who has boom potential if everything goes right with the Rams, but who also, I don't think it's that far-fetched to think a month and a half into the season could end up on the waiver wire.
That's true. And again, if they add another player and Beckham still in talks to go back to Los Angeles, that could change some things. But you got to be somewhat optimistic that the better quarterback play, better offense, and just hopefully he's healthy can lead to Allen Robinson returning as at least a top 15 to 20 caliber wide receiver. I think you said it best, though. Most people are going to draft him more as a borderline number 2, number 3 receiver in a very crowded group of wide receivers from 20 to about 40 because it's such a loaded position. Let's go down to another fun game that we could be looking at here. That's week 4 when you get the Kansas City Chiefs and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Patrick Mahomes versus Tom Brady. We're all looking forward to that one. But Heath, when you look at the Chiefs, clearly the big storyline is how do they replace Tyreek Hill? They traded Tyreek Hill to the Miami Dolphins. They brought in Juju Smith-Schuster. They drafted Sky Moore. A lot of different moving parts. Marquez Valdes-Scantling. So how do the Chiefs go about replacing Tyreek Hill? And is one of those receivers going to be startable for fantasy managers?
I think one of those wide receivers will be startable now. Will it be the same one every week? I'm not sure about that. First off, to answer the question, you will not replace Tyreek Hill. He is irreplaceable. But I do think that what they've tried to do is kind of piecemeal things. You've got Marquez Valdes-Scantling. He can do a lot of the downfield stuff that Tyreek Hill did before last year. Now, midway through last year, they pretty much took that away from the Chiefs. And Hill turned into more of a shorter area wide receiver, trying to do things after the catch. I think that's what they'll do with Juju Smith-Schuster. We saw Juju early in his career produce a lot of big plays on targets that weren't that far downfield. The last couple of seasons, we've seen none of it. Sky Moore, kind of a guy who can do both. He can operate in the slot very successfully. He can get behind the defense, but it might take him a year to get acclimated to this system. So they've got the pieces that can do all of the things. There's just not one guy on this team who can do all the things that Tyreek Hill did.
Yeah, it's going to be fun to see if Juju can bounce back, if Sky Moore is the answer, or is he another Mecole Hardman, who they once upon a time drafted in the 2nd round? And he obviously has not lived up to those expectations. So a lot of moving parts in that Chiefs receiving corps. It's going to be fun to see how fantasy managers react, Juju being the one that we expect to be drafted first in that same range, like an Allen Robinson. Dave, the other side of the ball, you got the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and we're waiting to find out the status of Chris Godwin. So suffered the torn ACL late in the season last year. We know it typically is a 9-month to a year recovery process till the player is back at full strength, unless, of course, your name is Adrian Peterson. But Chris Godwin, we've seen drafted as high as round 2. I got him in a draft in round 4. He's going to kind of go, I think, in that round 2 to round 5 range. But is he still an elite fantasy wide receiver coming into the upcoming campaign?
Yes, he's still an elite wide receiver. He gets a lot of targets, gets a lot of catches, gets a lot of red zone looks. He's got a pretty good quarterback throwing to him. The only question is how soon can he be healthy and contributing at the level that we're used to seeing? He's finished top 10 in PPR points per game 2 of the last 3 seasons, and the year he didn't, he finished 15th. So he's still got potential to be a good fantasy wide receiver with a shot at being great. I'm just hoping that he's back on the field in time for week 1. And if he's not, then you'll see Russell Gage probably get a serious uptick in targets, playing the role that Godwin has played with Brady for the last 2 seasons.
Yeah, we got to find out also, is Rob Gronkowski back? We're still waiting for that news to happen. That's what we expect. But still, again, some moving parts with this Buccaneers receiving core. You mentioned Russell Gage could be very popular early in the season if Godwin is on the PUP list. Let's go now to another matchup we're looking at, and that's week 5. You got the Chargers and the Browns. Now, again, we don't know if Deshaun Watson will be playing in that game because he might be facing a suspension, but could be a fun showdown between these two teams if the quarterback situation for the Browns is settled with the guy that they acquired this offseason in Deshaun Watson. But let's start with the Chargers, Dave, and Mike Williams coming off a very successful 2021 campaign, earned a 3-year contract extension, but fantasy managers still have a lot of questions about him. We know Keenan Allen is tried and true, one of the best fantasy options that we have at the position. Everything else is kind of settled for the Chargers for the most part, but is Mike Williams worth drafting as a number 2 receiver, number 3 receiver, and at what point in the draft are you going to consider the big wide receiver for the Chargers?
I've got him in that same range as Allen Robinson, probably a little bit ahead of Juju Smith-Schuster because he's on the Chargers and because I expect that Chargers offense to be awesome. That puts him in the round 5 range. Maybe you get lucky and you get him in round 6. And here's what I'm worried about with Mike Williams. You remember that hot start that he had last year, Jamey? He averaged 23 PPR points per game in those first 5 games. And then after that, he was around 12 PPR points per game the rest of the season. Go back and look at what he did all of 2020, 9.7 PPR points per game. 2019, 10.3 points per game. 2018, 10.8 PPR points per game. You get the picture. Which guy are we going to get? I'm nervous that he's not going to have that sky-high ceiling that we saw in the first 5 games, but I think he can still be a good contributor, and I really love this Chargers offense. I think that they could end up having a shot at making the Super Bowl, certainly putting up a lot of points along the way. Williams figures to fall into production as a result.
Yep, big defensive acquisitions, J.C. Jackson, Khalil Mack, so if they can stay healthy, could be formidable on both sides of the ball. And then, Heath, when you look at this Browns team, obviously a lot's in flux because we just don't know what's happening with Deshaun Watson. So how do you approach the Browns? Because it could be a lot of running early in the season if there is no Deshaun Watson, but if there is the star quarterback there for the majority of the season, Amari Cooper could be in a good spot, Donovan Peoples-Jones, David Njoku, David Bell, rookie that they drafted. So what's the approach with the Browns knowing that there's some uncertainty right now with Deshaun Watson?
Yeah, it's completely uncertainty. We don't have any inside information on that. My feeling on it has changed just a little bit with some of the way the last couple of months have gone. I kind of had just been planning on he's probably going to have a 4 to 6 game suspension. Now that doesn't feel entirely certain. It feels like it's possible that he might just play the whole year. In one quarterback leagues, and specifically regarding Watson, that's exactly how I would handle it. There's 18, 19 guys I'm fine with as a starter. There's plenty of depth there. I want to draft Deshaun Watson for his upside and not worry that much about the suspension. In 2 quarterback leagues, because the talent pool gets so much thinner, you have to be a little bit more, I think, concerned and maybe drop him down to that low-end number 1 quarterback range. As for the weapons, only one I'm really factoring this in too much on would be Amari Cooper, because if Cooper plays 17 games with Deshaun Watson, I think he's going to be a borderline top 12 wide receiver this year. You do, though, have to factor in Watson's suspension a little bit, and that might drop him into the number 2 range.
Yeah, it's just a storyline that we'll be keeping an eye on for, and it could clearly sway the receiving core there, the running backs, because they could put a lot more on Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt just to carry the team until Watson gets back, which could make those 2 guys fantastic. So a lot to keep an eye on with this Browns for the next couple of months until we get to training camp. We know exactly what Deshaun Watson is potentially dealing with and what the Browns offense is dealing with as well. Week 10, we get the Mike McCarthy Bowl. The Cowboys coach going back to Green Bay to face the Green Bay Packers, and could be a fun game there. Hopefully everybody's healthy once we get to that matchup. And we're looking at the Dallas Cowboys. And Dave, when you look at Ezekiel Elliott, and we know the season that he had last year where he was good from a total number standpoint, but week to week it was very ugly. And if you watch the games, you saw a lot more positive production from Tony Pollard, a lot more negative production from Ezekiel Elliott. And so what's the approach to the Cowboys backfield, specifically with Zeke? When are you comfortable drafting him, and which Zeke are we going to get?
In November, December, and January, Ezekiel Elliott averaged about 4 more touches per game than Tony Pollard. Those two could end up splitting. It might come down to how good Ezekiel Elliott looks at the beginning of the year. And last year, forget about that game against Tampa Bay. He looked terrible in that game. But after that, he ended up looking good until he started to get hurt, until that offensive line started to get banged up for Dallas. Maybe he's got a shot to recoup some of that statistical upside that we used to rely on him when we took him as a top 5 fantasy running back. Maybe that's still there, but I'm also worried that it might not be there and that Tony Pollard could be the breakout of the year at running back for the Cowboys. If this coaching staff sees that Ezekiel Elliott, if it's not clicking for him, they're going to move to Tony Pollard. Pollard's better for the passing game for them. He's more explosive of a runner than Ezekiel Elliott, and he could end up taking over as the lead back for Dallas long before the McCarthy Bowl takes place in Green Bay. I am nervous to draft Ezekiel Elliott.
I guess the one thing I would say is that Zeke was so good in pass protection last year. Tony Pollard's going to have to do a big job to prove that he should be on the field ahead of Ezekiel Elliott. So that can maybe keep Zeke on the field in those passing down situations. But definitely something to keep an eye on. Tony Pollard, arrow pointing up. Ezekiel Elliott, arrow potentially pointing down. If, in fact, maybe that knee injury wasn't the reason for his struggles toward the end of last season. Heath, I'm sure you've heard, as everybody else has, Packers no longer have Davante Adams. So the other side of the ball, when we look at Green Bay in this potential matchup, how are the Packers going to replace Davante Adams, and who is the receiver that you're targeting, if you're targeting anyone from this team?
Yeah, I mean, like I said with TYREEK Hill, they're not going to replace Davante Adams. They've not made a great effort at even trying. But right now, I would say Allen Lazard is my favorite wide receiver on this roster in terms of what I expect for 2022. Now, Christian Watson with a strong summer, a strong training camp could certainly change that, and he has the most upside of this receiving core. But for the most part, I'm not expecting any of these wide receivers to be top 25 wide receivers. I'm expecting a big boost in pass volume for Aaron Jones. We've seen Jones be an absolute star, one of the best running backs in fantasy whenever Davante Adams has been gone. I think he'll fill that role again. That will give A.J. Dillon a little bit more room in the backfield because they can play those two together more often. I think both might be top 20 running backs.
It'll be fun to see for both those guys, and we'll find out what the impact is on Aaron Rodgers. Let's go now to the next game we're looking at here, and that is Week 15. You got the Cardinals and the Broncos. So new quarterback in Denver, but receiving core for the Cardinals, obviously in flux. Heath told you earlier in the show when he was talking about winners from the schedule, Marquise Brown, because he's out, because DeAndre Hopkins is out for the first 6 games. So, Dave, I'll come to you on this one. When you look at the Cardinals receiving core, Hopkins missing the first 6 games, suspended for violating the NFL's policy on performance-enhancing drugs. Marquise Brown traded to the Cardinals on draft night from the Baltimore Ravens. You have Rondale Moore. You have A.J. Green. Give me the breakdown of the Cardinals receivers without Hopkins there the first 6 weeks.
I think Heath summed it up really well. Marquise Brown's got a chance to be a top 12 fantasy wide receiver to begin the year, and he might be able to still be like on the fence between a number 2 and a number 3 wide receiver when Hopkins comes back. And I'll tell you what, if Hopkins comes back and he's not explosive and Brown's playing well and he's got a huge target share, he's going to continue going as a top 15, maybe top 20 fantasy wide receiver. So I'm loving the idea of getting Marquise Brown in round 5. I think changing teams and the whole Hopkins situation has changed everything for Marquise Brown. But he's not the only one in Arizona that I think is worth paying attention to. Last year, final 4 games without DeAndre Hopkins, Zach Ertz, I don't even know if Kyle Ertz exists. Zach Ertz had a target share of 26.4%. Now, I know that there's going to be some other options there this year in Arizona, namely Trey McBride at tight end, but I think you're going to see Zach Ertz continue to play a sizable role in those first 6 games. Streaming tight end, draftable as a top 10 tight end, probably going to take him in that round 9 to 10 range. Just have somebody who can get you 5 for 50 as a floor each week through the first 6 weeks of the year.
Yep, hopefully those guys step up until Hopkins returns, and then we'll see what happens from the fantasy aspect of all these guys once Hopkins is back on the field. Heath, the other side of the ball, Russell Wilson goes to the Broncos. The Broncos now have the best fantasy offense in the NFL. When you look at the backfield, Javonte Williams and Melvin Gordon back. I know we don't love the two of them sharing touches, but still very quality backfield there. The receiving core with Cortland Sutton and Jerry Jeudy and Tim Patrick, the tight end situation could be very good. When you look at this Broncos offense, just how much have things improved for all the skill players with Russell Wilson around?
Okay, I would say that everything has improved for those guys a lot with Russell Wilson. I'm still not 100% convinced that things have improved for Russell Wilson in terms of the talent around him, other than the people that are going to be calling the plays, because I think that's going to be significantly better. But we've got a lot to find out about this Broncos receiving core, and that includes the tight ends. Jerry Jeudy, Courtland Sutton, Tim Patrick essentially have one really good fantasy season between them. We've ascribed that all to bad quarterback play and injuries, and that's fair. But one of those guys has to step up and actually prove that they are a must-start wide receiver. And then the tight ends, Albert O, Greg Dulcich, I'm afraid they're going to chop things up kind of like the running backs. We got really excited about Albert O for about 2 months. Now I'm not sure that he's going to be a top 12 tight end. So it's a great collection of talent and a lot of depth. I'm not sure for fantasy purposes that there's going to be the elite performer just because of that depth and how much those guys all project to share at running back, wide receiver, and tight end.
Do you want a sports network that delivers everything that matters about the game? The highlights, the picks, the instant analysis, no yelling, no fake debates, no politics. Hit the subscribe button and never miss a moment.